Tonight, the results of my eight-week investigation into the shredding controversy involving the Springfield Police Department.
Documents show certain internal affairs files were destroyed earlier than the original union contract called for.
One of those files destroyed was Deputy Chief Cliff Buscher's, even though it was the subject of a Freedom of Information Act request. And that made us wonder, what was in that file that was destroyed by the SPD? Here's part one of our special series, Ready, Set, Shred. On April 25th, the Springfield Police Department signed an agreement with its police union, reducing the amount of time before certain disciplinary documents could be destroyed from 5 to 4 years. That contract change allowed for the immediate destruction of more than 30 internal affairs files, including Deputy Chief Cliff Buscher's. Nearly 2 weeks before his file was destroyed, this Freedom of Information Act request was filed with the city asking for his internal affairs file. Specifically, the request asked for information concerning an incident involving Deputy Chief Buscher that took place at this Missouri resort in 2008. The same day that Buscher's file was destroyed, the man who filed that FOIA request was sent this letter from the city telling him simply, "The Springfield Police Department has no documents responsive to your request." According to these documents we obtained from the Taney County, Missouri Prosecutor's Office, Buscher, who was a commander in 2008, was charged with a felony, unlawful use of a weapon while intoxicated. The charge stated that Buscher fired his department-issued gun several times over this lake. The Taney County prosecutor confirms that he plea bargained the charge down to a disturbing the peace, a misdemeanor. The Taney County prosecutor also says Buscher pleaded guilty to the charge and admitted he was intoxicated when he fired his gun. According to this internal affairs document obtained by News Channel 20 on July 14, 2008, Buscher was suspended for 30 days and demoted from commander to lieutenant. But there is much more that is alleged to have happened that night 5 years ago at this Missouri lodge that has never before been made public. And it's all contained in these internal affairs documents surrounding the investigation. According to the documents obtained exclusively by News Channel 20, for 12 years, 4 Springfield police buddies and their sons gathered at this Missouri resort for a father-son get-together. In 2008, the 4 cops included Cliff Buscher, who was then a commander, Lieutenant Wendell Kurt Banks, Lieutenant Greg Williamson, his brother, former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson, and 10 kids, including their sons and their friends. We obtained one audio recording of the internal affairs interview of former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson and the transcripts from the recorded interviews with Lieutenant Kurt Banks, Jake Joslin, who was at 15 years old at the time, and Cliff Buscher about what they stated happened the night of Saturday, March 22, 2008. All of the documents show it all begins at this restaurant and bar called the Frosted Mug, where the group went that night. Statements show the kids had pizza and soda. Lieutenant Banks states that the adults drank beer and 1 round of tequila shots. Lieutenant Kurt Banks tells Internal Affairs, quote, "Buscher was definitely intoxicated. That's why I wouldn't let him drive." Statements made by Lieutenant Banks, former Deputy Chief Williamson, and Jake Joslin show the trouble starts when a woman in the bar is offended by a statement on a T-shirt that Cliff Buscher's young son is wearing. Former Deputy Chief Williamson says the woman confronts Commander Buscher about the T-shirt. This is the audio recording during Williamson's internal affairs interview concerning that argument.
They had a couple of words back and forth, so I turned around, and at that point, Cliff seems a little more agitated.
Jake Joslin stated in his interview that, quote, "This woman and Cliff were fighting with words at each other because the woman didn't appreciate what his son was wearing as a shirt, and he was firing back too." Joslin continues, and then Doug Williamson had to hold her back because, Cliff was saying he was going to hurt her or something. He didn't mean it, though. Internal Affairs asked Joslin, "Do you remember what he might have said, though?" Joslin replies, "I'm going to hit that B." Internal Affairs, "Okay, was it loud?" Joslin replies, "No, room voice." Lieutenant Banks stated the argument was loud, so he gathered up the kids and Commander Buscher, and they left the bar. Most of the kids got into a van. 2 other kids climbed into a pickup truck with Commander Buscher and Lieutenant Banks and headed back to the resort. All of the statements show former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson and his brother, Lieutenant Greg Williamson, stayed at the bar. When talking to Internal Affairs investigators, former Deputy Chief Williamson said his son told him what took place in the truck with Commander Buscher.
As Mr. Buscher was rummaging through the glove box, and he goes, "Dad, I thought he was looking for a mint," but he pulled the gun out, unholstered it, and said, "Who's in charge now?"
About that, Commander Buscher told Internal Affairs investigators, quote, "One of the kids said that that when we were in the parking lot, that I reached down and pulled it out and said something about showing somebody who's boss. I don't recall doing that. It's possible I did. I don't recall doing it. Lieutenant Banks told Internal Affairs he tried to get Commander Busher to give him the gun. Quote, I tried to convince him to put the gun away, that, he was just being stupid. He didn't do it. He kept the gun out. When asked by Internal Affairs investigators if he remembers Lieutenant Banks asking him to give him the gun, Commander Busher responds, no. According to the statements from Jake Joslin and Lieutenant Banks, shortly after arriving at the resort, both say they heard a gunshot. Both say Commander Busher fired a shot into the ground outside the main cabin. Documents show Commander Busher admitted to Internal Affairs that he shot at the ground to, quote, have a little fun with the kids. He continues, I fired a couple of rounds into the ground just to kind of scare them, get their attention. It did. According to statements made by Lieutenant Banks and Jake Joslin, the kids began screaming and running. Some kids popped the screen out of windows to escape the cabin. Both Commander Busher and Jake Joslin tell investigators that after initially being scared, the kids begin to laugh about the incident. But Lieutenant Banks didn't think it was funny. He tells investigators that he demanded Commander Busher give him the gun. Quote, after a brief argument, just trying to get the gun from Cliff, it was pretty obvious he wasn't going to give it to me. He just kept wanting to go back to the bar. I kept telling him no. Lieutenant Banks says Commander Busher is growing more angry, saying the woman he argued with in the bar was, quote, very disrespectful to him, and that she can't treat me like that. Former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson told investigators Lieutenant Banks told him this.
Cliff wanted to go back to town and in Cliff's words, kill the
Internal Affairs investigators did not ask Commander Busher about that. At this point, Lieutenant Banks tells investigators that Commander Busher went onto the back porch and started firing shots toward the lake. In his statement to Internal Affairs investigators, Busher admits he stood on the porch of the cabin and shot into the bank of the lake. Again, statements from Busher and Joslin show that after initially being scared, the kids started laughing about it. This is what happens next, according to Jake Joslin. He says that Commander Busher approached him with his gun pointed at the ground. Joslin says Busher said to him in a joking manner, quote, you want to lose that leg, mother expletive? Both Lieutenant Banks and former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson said Joslin told him that Commander Busher made that statement. When asked by investigators if he remembered saying that to Joslin, Commander Busher said no. When asked if he threatened anyone with a weapon, Commander Busher again responded, no. At this point, Lieutenant Banks tells investigators that he sent the kids to another cabin and then drove back to the bar to get the Williamson brothers. On the way back to the cabins, Lieutenant Banks says he told them what Commander Busher had done. As the three officers arrive at the cabin, former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson states that this is what he saw.
My memory is that there were kids hiding on the corners of the other cabins and behind trees.
Entering the main cabin, former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson says he sees his brother Greg talking to Commander Busher. Fearing Busher is still armed, Deputy Chief Doug Williamson says he tackled the men.
I'm upset at this time. I'm telling him that I'm calling the police. I'm telling him he's going to jail. Telling him that I would file an IA complaint against him, and I'm laying it all out.
According to Commander Busher's statement to investigators, he's taken and placed in another cabin alone and told to stay there. The statements from Lieutenant Banks and former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson show they questioned the kids about what happened. Then statements show the officers decide to call the Taney County Sheriff's Department.
122.
After an investigation, the deputies take Commander Busher to the Sheriff's Department, where he is booked and jailed. This report News Channel 20 obtained from the Taney County Sheriff's Department show Lieutenant Banks and Jake Joslin wrote brief statements about the events at the cabin. Lieutenant Banks' statement leaves out most everything later that he told Internal Affairs. And Joslin's statement mentions nothing about the statement he later made to Internal Affairs about Commander Busher approaching him with his gun in hand, pointed at the ground, and saying in a joking manner, quote, you want to lose that leg, mother expletive. Lieutenant Banks refused to be interviewed for this story. Jake Joslin refused my request to be interviewed as well. Back in Springfield, Busher is demoted from commander to lieutenant and suspended for 30 days, according to this Internal Affairs document. He declined repeated requests for an interview. Former Deputy Chief Doug Williamson, who's now retired, says he was suspended for 1 day because he used foul language around the children. In 2009, Assistant Chief Robert Williams was named Springfield's top cop. As chief, Williams promoted Busher from lieutenant over the rank of commander to deputy chief. even though Chief Williams likely knew most, if not all, of the details in Busher's file regarding the Missouri incident. That's because several of the internal affairs reports show that as assistant chief, Williams took part in some of those interviews, even questioning Busher during his. Chief Williams also declined to be interviewed for this story, citing ongoing litigation. That litigation is a lawsuit filed by Calvin Christian against the city over the destruction of Deputy Chief Busher's internal affairs file that Christian asked for in his Freedom of Information Act request. Tonight, our investigation examines the efforts by the police department and the city attorney's office to change the police union contract, allowing for the immediate shredding of Deputy Busher's disciplinary file, even though it was the subject of our Freedom of Information Act request. And we will introduce you to one person who told the chief of police and a top city attorney not to destroy Deputy Chief Busher's file. And now, part 2 of Ready, Set, Shred. 4 Springfield cops and a bunch of kids were vacationing at this resort in the Missouri Ozarks in 2008. There was an incident on the night of March 22nd involving then Commander Cliff Busher. These documents from the Taney County, Missouri Sheriff's Department state that then Commander Busher was intoxicated and fired his gun several times over a lake. After initially being charged with a felony, these court documents show Commander Busher pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. He was fined, sentenced to probation, and ordered to serve community service. Back home, after an internal affairs investigation, the Springfield Police Department gave Busher a 30-day suspension and demoted him from commander to lieutenant, according to this internal affairs document. In 2010, Chief Robert Williams promoted Busher from lieutenant over the rank of commander to his current position, deputy chief. But as we showed you Monday, police internal affairs documents obtained exclusively by News Channel 20 show the alleged events of that night were more serious than what was reported at the time. Those documents are internal affairs interviews with 2 other high-ranking Springfield police officers and 1 teenage boy, all of whom were there on that night in 2008. These court documents from the Taney County, Missouri Prosecutor's Office show that Commander Busher was intoxicated and armed and fired a gun. The 2 police officers and the 15-year-old teen also accused Commander Busher of making idle threats of violence about a woman he argued with at a bar. Then there is this accusation from the internal affairs interview with 15-year-old Jake Joslin. He stated while Busher was still holding the gun, which was pointed at the ground, Commander Busher looked at him, and in a joking manner, Busher said, quote, "You want to lose that leg, mother expletive." In his internal affairs interview, Busher stated that he didn't remember saying that, and he denied ever threatening anyone with a gun. Deputy Chief Busher's internal affairs file, with details from that night, were destroyed by the police department after the union contract was changed. So Busher's file and dozens of others could be shredded immediately. How did that unfold? The most recent chapter starts Monday, April 11th of this year. That's when Calvin Christian, a Springfield police blogger, sent this Freedom of Information Act request, or FOIA, to the city, asking for Deputy Chief Busher's internal affairs file regarding that 2008 Missouri incident. According to several sources, in the days following Christian's FOIA request, talks began between the police department, the police union, and the city attorney's office to change the existing contract. The original contract called for the SPD to destroy some internal affairs disciplinary records, like Deputy Chief Cliff Busher's, 5 years after the date of punishment. According to this SPD document we obtained, Deputy Chief Busher was suspended and demoted for the Missouri incident on July 14, 2008, meaning before the contract change, his file was eligible to be shredded on July 14, 2013. But the union contract change under discussion in the days following Christian's FOIA request would allow internal affairs disciplinary records to be destroyed 4 years after the date of punishment. That change would allow for the immediate destruction of Deputy Chief Busher's file along with more than 30 others. On Thursday, April 18th, Calvin Christian received this letter from the city's attorney's office telling him it needed 5 more business days to review Deputy Chief Busher's file to see if it was exempt from his FOIA request. The letter states it will respond to Christian no later than April 25th. On Tuesday, April 23rd, enter Lieutenant Chris Mueller. He's the head of internal affairs at the Springfield Police Department. News Channel 20 has obtained a series of emails written by Lieutenant Mueller showing that on this day, he found out about the plan to change the contract, allowing for the immediate destruction of Deputy Chief Busher's file. These emails, obtained by News Channel 20, show that Lieutenant Mueller raised repeated objections to the contract change to Police Chief Williams and Assistant City Attorney Jeanette Wittendorf.
This email is from May 5th. It is from Lieutenant Mueller, and it's sent to Assistant City Attorney Wittendorf. The email recounts 2 phone conversations that Lieutenant Mueller says he had with Wittendorf, warning her not to change the contract, allowing for the immediate destruction of the internal affairs files. The first conversation with Wittendorf, according to the email, took place on Tuesday, April 23rd. Here, Lieutenant Mueller writes how he expressed his concerns over, quote, expunging files that were subject to a valid FOIA request, specifically my informing you of what the ramifications could be, the potential motives behind the movement, and that I provided you with background information regarding one particular case involving Deputy Chief Busher. The second phone call with Wittendorf took place on April 24th. According to the email, during that phone call to Wittendorf, Lieutenant Mueller writes how he reiterated his concerns. Another email, written by Lieutenant Mueller, also on May 5th, is sent to Chief Robert Williams. This email recounts the meeting Lieutenant Mueller says he had with Chief Williams in his office on Wednesday, April 24th, one day before the shredding took place. In this email to Chief Williams, Lieutenant Mueller writes how he, quote, vehemently advised against the rush to expunge files that appeared to be in response to a FOIA request. Continuing, Lieutenant Mueller writes, quote, that I did so to the point that I stated I wanted no part of it, and even understood if that meant you need to transfer me.
Keep in mind, as we told you in our previous story, Chief Williams was aware of at least some, if not all, of what was in Deputy Chief Busher's internal affairs file. Several of the internal affairs documents we obtained show that Williams, then an assistant chief, was involved in the internal affairs questioning of some of the officers who were there during the 2008 incident in Missouri. Chief Williams even took part in questioning then Commander Busher during his interview. Thursday, April 25th. The deal is done. This is a copy of the document called an MOU, changing the union contract to allow certain internal affairs documents to be destroyed after 4 years instead of 5. That change allows for the immediate shredding of Deputy Chief Busher's file and dozens of other internal affairs files. It's signed by the police union president, Chief Williams, and initialed by Assistant City Attorney Wittendorf. That same day, 1:25 p.m., these emails show that Assistant City Attorney Wittendorf emailed her boss, Chief City Attorney Mark Cullen, quote, IA needs confirmation from you that this is to be effective immediately. Chief City Attorney Cullen responds, the expungement of files subject to that MOU needs to occur immediately. As head of internal affairs, it is Lieutenant Mueller's job to shred those IA documents. At 3:01 p.m., this email shows that Lieutenant Mueller wrote Chief Williams demanding a direct order before he'll begin the shredding. Quote, I respectfully request your direct order to proceed with the file expungements. At 4:12 p.m., this email from Lieutenant Mueller is sent to Assistant Attorney Wittendorf. Quote, the chief just called via cell phone and gave me the direct order. It shall be done. At 4:30, just 18 minutes after Lieutenant Mueller's email stating he will begin the shredding, this letter from the city attorney's office was emailed to Calvin Christian regarding his FOIA request for Deputy Chief Busher's file. It says simply, quote, the Springfield Police Department has no documents responsive to your request. A few days later, the story about the contract change breaks in the media. For about a week, there's a flurry of activity about what's taken place. Suggestions of a cover-up were raised by members of City Council. In his one and only press conference on the matter, Chief Robert Williams said, the fact that a FOIA request coincided with the shredding of those documents doesn't mean any wrongdoing took place.
The things that I chose to do that I didn't do is given the perception that somehow the Springfield Police Department has done something wrong, and I don't believe that to be the case.
In addition, Chief Williams said at the press conference the contract change was done to make the department more efficient. Alderman Frank Edwards says council members questioned Chief Williams in private about the shredding.
Because let's be honest, if you've got a $38 million budget and you've got 300 plus employees, shredding 36 records is going to make you efficient? Really?
This letter from Union President Don Edwards was sent to the rank and file one day after the contract change on April 26th. Edwards writes that the contract change was made to, quote, keep our personnel files away from those that would intend to embarrass us. Edwards has not responded to several interview requests. Chief Williams wouldn't answer our questions, citing a pending lawsuit against the city filed by Calvin Christian, the man that filed the FOIA request for the Busher file.
2 weeks after the files are shredded, Mayor Mike Houston weighs in, saying he knew nothing about the contract change and didn't know the files had been destroyed until after the fact. Still, he lends his support to Chief Williams and Deputy Chief Busher.
I think that probably this is a direct result of different factions within the Springfield Police Department that are attempting to discredit one person who they consider to be a candidate for Chief of Police.
This email is dated May 6th. It's from Chief Williams, who's responding to Lieutenant Mueller's email, referring to the contract change, allowing for the shredding. Chief Williams writes, quote, "I had to lean more heavily than normal on the legal advice that I was receiving." Chief Williams continues, "I assured you that I would ask the question, 'Are you sure?' before proceeding. I got an answer, and based on that, I proceeded." Chief Williams states, "My only regrets in this whole matter is that I did not approach my boss, Mayor Houston, and take advantage of his years of experience. In hindsight, I do not know how I made such a blunder, but you did not make it, and I take full responsibility." Chief Williams also states, "I have managed to harm the image of the agency by giving the perception, by some, that we acted in an illegal manner. I do not believe this to be the case." Chief Williams ends his email to Lieutenant Mueller by stating this, "You had no part in it, and I know that if you thought what we were doing was illegal, you would have never taken part, no matter who issued the order." On the same day Chief Williams sent that email, sources say Lieutenant Mueller met with Mayor Houston in his office. That same day, May 6th, Mayor Houston sent this letter to State Attorney General Lisa Madigan, asking her to investigate the contract change, allowing for the destruction of Deputy Chief Busher's internal affairs file, along with dozens of others, to see if any wrongdoing was committed.
The Attorney General's office declined to investigate the case. The case is currently being investigated by the Illinois State's Attorney Appellate Prosecutor's Office, along with the Illinois State Police. And several well-placed sources tell us that the ISP has already interviewed several of the people involved in our story, including Lieutenant Chris Mueller. Tonight, our 8-week-long investigation continues with a look at the shredding process itself. Were any laws broken, and if so, were they done intentionally? Here's part 3 of Ready, Set, Shred.
The Illinois State's Attorney's Appellate Prosecutor's Office, along with the state police, are currently investigating to determine if any criminal or public records laws were broken regarding the April 25th shredding of dozens of Springfield Police internal affairs documents, including Deputy Chief Cliff Busher's file. As we showed you in our previous stories, this man, Calvin Christian, a web blogger who writes about the SPD, filed this Freedom of Information Act request on April 11th. Requesting Deputy Chief Cliff Busher's internal affairs file. Specifically, he asked for the details of a 2008 Missouri incident at this Ozark Mountains resort. In our previous stories, we showed you the details from these internal affairs documents. They contain the statements made by these 2 other high-ranking Springfield police officers and this teenager. All were at the resort with then-Commander Busher. These documents from the Taney County, Missouri Prosecutor's Office stated Busher was intoxicated and fired his weapon on 2 occasions. During internal affairs interviews, all 3 people accused Busher of making idle threats about a woman whom he'd argued with earlier in a bar. This is audio recorded during Deputy Chief Doug Williamson's internal affair interview. Williamson says this is what another officer, Lieutenant Kurt Banks, told him about that allegation.
Cliff wanted to go back to town and in Cliff's words, kill the
According to Busher's internal affairs interview, investigators never asked him about that. But there's more. Jake Joslin, who was at the time 15 years old, told investigators in 2008 that Commander Busher was holding a gun, pointed at the ground, looked him in the eye and said in a joking way, "You want to lose that leg, mother expletive." When asked about that during his internal affairs interview, Busher said he didn't remember saying that. This is the information in Deputy Chief Busher's file that Calvin Christian's FOIA request asked for. It's also important to note that Christian's FOIA request stated this, quote, "If these files are denied from release, I am requesting that everything is preserved until all appeals are exhausted." This is a copy of the single-page agreement that changed the current police contract on April 25th. The agreement reduces the wait time to destroy certain internal affairs files from 5 years to 4. That change allowed for the immediate shredding of Deputy Chief Busher's file. It's signed by Police Chief Robert Williams, Don Edwards, the head of the police union, and it is initialed by Assistant City Attorney Jeanette Wittendorf. Chief Williams refused to be interviewed, Wittendorf refused an on-camera interview, and Edwards did not respond to repeated requests for an interview. Our investigation reveals the SPD did not have the authority to destroy those documents. It all has to deal with a series of state laws laid out in the Local Records Act. In short, the Act lists what a municipality, like the City of Springfield, must do before destroying documents like Deputy Chief Cliff Buscher's internal affairs file. The governing body that decides when documents can be destroyed under the Local Records Act is the Local Records Commission. The Local Records Commission is made up of a panel of local and state officials. The Local Records Commission is a part of the Secretary of State's office. When wanting to destroy documents, the first step a municipality must take is to fill out this form called an application for authority to dispose of local records. The Springfield Police Department did that, requesting the 5-year disposal of certain files, which was consistent with the police union contract. In December 2012, the SPD was granted approval to destroy certain records after 5 years, which included Deputy Chief Cliff Buscher's internal affairs file. But remember, the police department and its union agreed to change the contract, calling for the destruction of disciplinary documents from 5 to 4 years. As a result, the Local Records Act states that the police department then needed to fill out and file an amendment asking the Local Records Commission for permission to lower the destruction timetable from 5 to 4 years. This letter, dated June 4th, shows the police department did do that. Problem is, the internal affairs files were destroyed on April 25th. According to the Local Records Act, amendments cannot be filed retroactive. As a result, the Local Records Commission deferred the request. David Jones is one of the members on the Local Records Commission. He says that aside from the retroactive issue, the commission deferred the SPD's amendment request because one of the files the police department sought permission to destroy, Deputy Chief Buscher's internal affairs file, was the subject of a Freedom of Information Act request.
I understand there's a FOIA out there for these records. And anytime there's pending or possible litigation out there for records, no matter what the retention is, you don't have the authority to dispose of it.
But that's exactly what the police department did. That said, were any criminal laws broken as a result of the shredding? This is what the Local Records Act states about tampering with public records. A person who knowingly and without lawful authority alters, destroys, defaces, removes, or conceals any public record commits a Class 4 felony. Sources with direct knowledge of the investigation tell News Channel 20 this is a section of the Local Records Act that the Illinois State Appellate Prosecutor's Office and the Illinois State Police are focusing on as they continue their probe of the April 25th shredding incident. In addition, sources tell us, they are also looking to determine if the proper procedures laid out in the Local Records Act were followed by the police department before it destroyed the documents in question. This email from Assistant City Attorney Jeanette Wittendorf to Chief City Attorney Mark Cullen was written just hours before Deputy Chief Buscher's file was shredded on April 25th. Wittendorf writes, "Hi Mark, IA needs confirmation from you that this is to be effective immediately." Chief City Attorney Cullen responds, "Based on the MOU executed with the PBPA, the expungement of files subject to that MOU needs to occur immediately." But in the days prior to the shredding, Assistant City Attorney Wittendorf and SPD Chief Robert Williams were warned repeatedly not to destroy those documents. Most notably, Deputy Chief Buscher's file because it was under that FOIA request by Calvin Christian. Those warnings are documented in a series of emails obtained by News Channel 20, and they're written by the head of Internal Affairs, Lieutenant Chris Mueller. Lieutenant Mueller to Assistant City Attorney Wittendorf, quote, "I respectfully request that you inform the mayor of my conversation with you on the Tuesday before the expungements occurred, expressing my concerns over expunging files that were subject to a valid FOIA request." Lieutenant Mueller continues, "I called you again on Wednesday evening, reiterating the same concerns." Here's Lieutenant Mueller to Chief Williams. "I met with you in your office and vehemently advised against the rush to expunge files that appeared to be in response to a FOIA request." This is Chief Williams' email response to Lieutenant Mueller. Referring to the contract change, Chief Williams states he had to, quote, "lean more heavily than normal on the legal advice I was receiving." Chief Williams continues, "I assured you that I would ask the question, 'Are you sure?' before proceeding. I got an answer, and based on that answer, I proceeded." I want to make this crystal clear. The records that were destroyed on April 25th by the Springfield Police Department,
they did not have authorization to destroy those records, correct?
Correct.
And in addition, because there's a pending FOIA request, you would have denied it, period, even if it was 5 years.
Yeah.